Hello guys, welcome to my build of the Polikarpov I-16 Type 18. The I-16 was a Soviet fighter designed in the 1930s, and it was used in the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Winter War, the Spanish Civil War, and on the Eastern Front in World War II. This is Eduard's Weekend Edition of the kit in 1/48 scale. Once you get a look at it, you might think it's close to 1/72 scale, but no, this is a 1/48 scale aircraft. It is just quite a small, squat aircraft. It looks almost like one of those egg aircraft, those egg model kits, which are quite popular these days. Being a weekend edition, we have no photo etch in this kit, and we have only a single colour scheme, which is this blue and green scheme on the box art. That said, I'm sure there's an option to add some black camouflage paint on top of that, if desired. The construction is fairly basic, some detail in the cockpit, the two cockpit halves coming together, that fuselage going onto the single piece lower wing, and then the tops of the wings going on, elevators at the back, engine cover at the front, undercarriage, and done. This is the single colour scheme, so this is the Soviet VVS in the Leningrad area, spring 1942. Moving on to the construction, we have to add some details to the fuselage halves, and you can see here just how small they are compared there to my hand, and here to a ME-109. And it was the Messerschmitt 109 which was faced initially by the I-16 on the Eastern Front. So you can see a huge difference here in fuselage length, although not quite so much in the wingspan. Very squat aircraft, the I-16. Sometimes I find the easiest way to add small pieces like this, rather than using tweezers which can ping them across the room, is to use a little bit of blue tack or similar to hold them, guide them into place, and then you can just lightly remove the blue tack afterwards. We have these mouldings around the exhaust exits to put into place. Plus a seat and some rudder pedals. The correct positioning for this bucket seat is not super clear, though there is a diagram to tell you the angle in the instructions. To be honest, I'm not sure how accurate this cockpit representation is or how detailed it is, but if we slide it into place here in the fuselage, you can see just how small that fuselage entrance is, that cockpit entrance is. So there's not a lot of detail going to be seen there anyway. Typically I like to glue the cockpit detail to one side of the fuselage, paint that up and then add the second side, but I couldn't do that with this kit because the whole cockpit floor sort of balances here between the two halves without a lot of positive location area. So it wasn't really possible to attach it to just one side. We do have an instrument panel which goes in place. Again, there aren't really any location pins for that, and it also goes quite deep into the cockpit. So if we look from the top, it's not really going to be too visible. If it were absent, we would see the light, perhaps, but we won't see much detail of the instrument panel. The wheel wells are moulded to the underside of the wing, so there's nothing to paint on the inside of that. However, we can see through the underside to the upper parts of the wing on these gaps on the outside here, so we do need to make sure that we paint the inside of those upper wings in that area. From research, it seems that the interior of Soviet cockpits were either a grey or a green colour. I didn't really see any specific colour from any of the major paint manufacturers, so I simply mixed some XF69 from Tamiya, which is NATO black, with a bit of white to give me a medium grey colour. That was applied both to the cockpit floor and seat and the inside of the fuselage. The leather headrest was given a bit of detail painting with some Vallejo model colour acrylics, as was the control column. We have this single instrument panel decal here. I did consider painting the instrument panel, but I figured it would be a lot of work for something that wouldn't be seen, and in the end this decal went down very nicely and conformed to the contours of that panel really well. I did some sponge chipping on the seat. And then glued it into place. And there we go, I think that looks fairly decent. In terms of the engine, we have this single piece here for the radial engine, which will be painted but is mostly covered up by the cowling here. And we have a simple 2-blade propeller. Here the Vallejo metal colour is a little thin and runs onto the black, but honestly that can't be seen once the cowling's in place. So that everything lined up correctly, I added the upper wings to the lower wing and the fuselage to the lower wing all in one go. And while the glue was drying, I dry fitted the engine cowling to ensure everything was correctly lined up. While that was drying, I worked on the landing gear, which are particularly spindly on this aircraft. We've got 3 really thin looking supports there for the wheels. I glued those supports together and dry fitted them into the underside of the wings to get them in the right angle, but kept them separate for painting. Once the glue is dry, we've got some seams that need to be taken care of and a gap on the underside, but nothing too big. And of course the elevators and the rudder. There we go with the seam lines filled and sanded a little bit. Still needs a bit more work, but what an interesting looking aircraft this is. Really, really strange. So short. There's something about it I quite like though. And at this stage I realised that I kept meaning to add the exhausts before I closed the fuselage up, and I kept putting it off because it looked really fiddly, and then ultimately I forgot to do it until now. So back out with a blue tack to try and guide these into the correct position. Once I was happy with everything, I gave the whole aircraft a coat of primer. Then I decided to go a bit old school and do some panel line pre-shading, as you can see here. The correct colour scheme is AMT4, which is the green colour for the top side, and AMT7, which is the light blue for the underside. The paints I used were matches for those by AK Real Colours, which is rapidly becoming my go-to paint choice, especially for unusual colours like this. They have a huge range of colours. You generally don't have to find yourself mixing anything. So here's that AMT7 on the underside. I did go a little bit thick here, and so a lot of that pre-shading is lost. And then after letting that dry and masking the underside, here is the top side with the AMT4 green. At this stage I decided I actually quite like the green on its own. However, one thing I did want to do here is add a bit of variety to the wings. Apparently the leading edges of the wings and the centres were aluminium skinned, but the rest of them were fabric covered. So I figured that even if you apply the same paint colour to fabric and metal, you tend to get a slightly different colour result. So with that in mind, I masked off the areas of the wings which I understood to be fabric. Then I sprayed those in a slightly lightened version of the AMT green. I did the same thing with the elevators, as I imagined they would also be fabric covered. Then it was a case of just the few small details, so the exhausts, the machine guns and the undercarriage, and our construction was almost complete. The decals for this kit are fairly minimal, primarily the national insignia and the identification number on the side. They were applied with the help of a cotton bud to push them down into the surface, and some Tamiya Mark Fit strong to help them go down. They did conform well to the contours of the aircraft, although I think my surface wasn't quite as smooth as it should be, because in the end I did end up with a little bit of silvering behind some of the decals. At this point I realised I'd missed off the silver or aluminium ring around the engine. Knowing how much mess it can make airbrushing metallic paints, I simply brush painted some Vallejo metal colour dark aluminium. These are great paints for brush painting, and they also airbrush very well without any thinning. The next step was some weathering to dirty up the surface and highlight the panel lines. I made a pin wash mixture from some odourless thinner and some Abteilung oil paint. This is their sepia colour. It was applied around details, in the panel lines and so on. Because I gave everything a coat of matte VMS varnish before I did this, you can see it sort of seeps into the surface a little bit. But that's absolutely fine, we can blend it away later. And to be honest, I think it helps give a bit of a dirty appearance, which is what I'm looking for. So once that's given some time to dry, I can clean it away with a clean brush dipped in thinner, either wiping it away completely or blending it into the surface, dragging it back in the direction of the airflow. With oil paints taking so long to dry, you can go backwards and forwards with this effect, removing some, adding some, removing some, until you're happy with the result. And of course a similar effect was done on the underside. I went a bit heavier here than I might normally. I'm trying to add a bit more weathering to my aircraft than I usually do, and I think that's quite evident here on the underside. Both the wingtips and the propeller were given a small amount of chipping using the sponge chipping technique. And it occurs to me from this image that I think I've chipped the wrong edge of the propeller there. I got the trailing edge rather than the leading edge. Now unfortunately my cockpit glass was broken in two for some reason, so I fitted that as tightly as I could, trying to minimise that crack, but to be honest there's not much I could do about it. Finally I used some of these Humbrol aging powders pack. These were given to me by Airfix during the Creators Day event last July. We get these 6 tubs of pigments in here which are very fine. My only complaint about them is they've got no labels on them, so you have to sort of work out what's what. I suppose to an extent it doesn't really matter, does it? Just pick the colour that matches what you want. But we've clearly got 2 tones of rust, 3 tones of rust there, a primer colour, and then a smoke and a black. I started with the smoke, putting small amounts on for exhaust stains. Because we've got a matte varnish finish, that bites quite well into that. But it also means that it's going to be very hard to remove it if you make a mistake. Later I switched to the black powder because the grey wasn't quite dark enough. And with that done, our aircraft is complete. Okay guys, there we go. That was my build of Eduard's 1/48 scale I-16 Type 18. Despite the slight amount of silvering on the decals there, which was entirely my fault, I'm really happy with the result here. I think you can just about make out the different green tones in the metal and fabric parts, and I'm happy with the slightly dirtier look that this aircraft has, especially considering it's only a single colour. I think that makes a big difference. So I hope you enjoyed this build. My next video will hopefully be some progress on the 1/24 scale Airfix Spitfire. That is all filmed, I just need to edit it and bring it together. Unfortunately, the next few videos that I produce are going to be build-only videos or reviews rather than involving any painting. And that's simply because I've had some stitches in my face recently just above my eye, and unfortunately that means I can't wear a respirator, so I can't use my airbrush. However, it also means that I've got 3 or 4 models lined up waiting for paint, ready for when I can get back to that airbrush. So before I go, let me say a huge thank you to my YouTube members and Patreon supporters. They've already seen some sneak previews of my upcoming projects, and if you would like to see those too, then you can find links to join in the description below. But whether you are a YouTube member, Patreon supporter, viewer, subscriber, liker, commenter, disliker, thank you very much for watching. It's very much appreciated. And until next time, have fun modelling.